The wind tore across the dry plains like a living thing, carrying grit and the faint metallic scent of distant blood. A lone rider hunched over the reins, face streaked with dust, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun burned the earth in cruel streaks of orange and gold. His horse stumbled over a hidden rock, and he grunted, muscles straining, hands blistered, fingers gripping the worn leather saddle, as if letting go would mean falling into oblivion. The ranch lay miles behind him, a mirage of smoke and memories he no longer deserved. She watched from the porch of the half-ruined homestead, the wood creaking under her weight. Her hair, once braided neatly, fell in wild waves across her shoulders, kissed by sun and wind. The papers of her inheritance lay scattered on the floor behind her. Maps, letters, deeds, things that had once meant power, now meaningless. She had screamed, once, when the truth of her barrenness became a sentence she could not escape. No husband, no children, no future but empty acres and the weight of expectation. And yet, standing there, she felt an ache she could not name, a longing that clawed at the hollow in her chest. The cowboy appeared at the edge of the horizon, a shadow moving against fire and dust. His clothes were torn, his hat battered, eyes weary but defiant, carrying the exhaustion of miles, of nights spent under nothing but the stars and the indifferent gaze of coyotes. He dismounted with a quiet grace, a low sigh escaping him as his boots touched the dirt, the world seeming to hold its breath in that moment. She did not move. She could not. There was recognition in her gaze, a flash of anger, a flash of longing, and something else, something deeper, almost unbearable. Her lips parted, but no sound came, and she swallowed hard, tasting the dust of years, of mistakes she hadn't even begun to understand. He approached slowly, each step deliberate, careful. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the wind whistling through broken shutters and dry grasses. His hands were scarred, calloused, evidence of a life too hard, too unforgiving. Yet his eyes, dark, steady, carried a fire that spoke of hope he could not name. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered finally, voice trembling. "I have nowhere else to go," he said, low, almost a confession. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not plead. There was only truth in the simplicity of his words. The sky darkened, clouds rolling in like the shadows of unseen predators. She shivered, feeling the chill creep into her bones despite the heat of the day. Memories struck her suddenly. Laughter, betrayal, promises made and broken, nights of loneliness where her body ached for something it would never bear. The land around her, once familiar, now felt alien. A mirror of her inner emptiness. He reached for the door, hesitated, and then gently pushed it open, letting the dry wind follow him in. The smell of old wood, of burnt embers, of cold earth hit him. The room was sparsely furnished, a single chair overturned in the corner, a table scarred by years of use and neglect. She moved closer, hands trembling, reaching instinctively to steady him, even as her heart beat with confusion and fear. "Why are you here?" she asked again, sharper this time. Her voice a mixture of accusation and something more fragile, something that tasted of longing. He looked at her, unflinching, and in his silence, the answer unfolded. He was here because there was nowhere else for him. Yes, but also because the land, broken and barren, reminded him of her, reminded him of the impossibility of love stitched with mistakes. The wind rose suddenly, rattling the windows, tossing her hair across her face. She caught it, pressing it back, and in that moment he saw it, the raw, untamed vulnerability she tried to hide. The same vulnerability he had seen before, in fleeting glances, in letters that had been torn and burned, in nights he had spent wandering her property when she had not known that he stepped closer. Their shadows merged in the flickering light of the setting sun, elongated and trembling across the floorboards. She flinched, not from fear, but from the awareness that the world had shifted, that a choice lay before her she had been too scared to make before. "You can leave," she said, her voice quieter now, almost a plea. "I can," he replied, but there was no movement. No hesitation either. Just the quiet assertion that some things could not be undone, that some truths demanded confrontation. Outside, the storm finally broke. Rain lashed against the roof, pouring through gaps in the shingles. The wind howled in the trees, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the world seemed to vanish. They stood together, soaked and shivering, two broken souls suspended in a space where time no longer mattered, where past wounds pressed against the present like ghosts demanding recognition. She closed her eyes and let the rain fall on her face, tasting salt and earth, grief and memory. Somewhere in that storm, she thought she heard a heartbeat, hers his the land's. Something fragile and living, stubborn against the cruelty of circumstance. When she opened her eyes, he was still there, not asking, not demanding, just waiting. And she knew then that the fight, the real fight, had only begun. Not against the land, not against the wind, not even against the past, but against the silence inside her own heart. A crack of lightning lit the room, revealing the lines on their faces, the scars of years spent fighting invisible enemies. And in that brief, electric moment, she screamed, not in anger, not in despair, but in recognition of a truth she could not yet voice. He had broken into her life, and in doing so, had broken something inside her too, something she could never reclaim in the same way again. The storm raged around them. Outside, the plains stretched endless, indifferent. Inside, a fragile ember flickered between them, small but stubborn, promising a fire that might one day burn through the ash. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, a memory whispered, love, betrayal, and the price of courage. The morning light arrived slow and silver, filtering through the low-hanging clouds and casting a quiet glow across the prairie. Elias rose first, his body aching in ways he had long grown accustomed to, the stiffness of age and labor a constant reminder that he had survived far more than any man should. He moved carefully, stretching his old joints, and caught sight of Mara tending the small garden she had planted by the river. The sight brought a rare smile to his face. She was a quiet miracle, resilient yet delicate, her hands coaxing life from soil that seemed unwilling to give. He approached her cautiously, as he always did, and for a moment they worked in silence, their motions synchronizing without words. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant storms. Mara glanced at him, eyes soft, and held out a hand smeared with soil. Elias took it gently, his own hands rough and scarred. For a fleeting heartbeat, time seemed suspended. Two souls connected by survival, by shared solitude, by something unspoken yet profound. The cattle had scattered farther than expected overnight, spurred by the distant rumble of a storm that no human eye could yet see. Elias tightened his coat against the wind and set off with Mara at his side. Every step along the rocky terrain was a negotiation between age, weariness, and necessity. The prairie stretched endlessly, a canvas of muted gold and shadow, the storm rolling in like a living thing. He could feel the tension coiling around him, in the stiff set of his shoulders and the way his eyes never rested for long. Mara's presence, steady and unwavering, offered a fragile counterbalance to the chaos of the world. By midday, the first rain began to fall, gentle at first, then in sharp, insistent sheets. The cattle huddled, drenched and wary, as Elias guided them toward a narrow valley, a natural shelter against the relentless wind. Mara moved close, holding her hat against the storm, her hair plastered to her face, and without thinking, Elias reached out to steady her. Their hands met, soaked and trembling, and again, no words passed. The silence was enough, an acknowledgement of dependence, of trust, of the slow weaving of a bond that neither of them had expected to find in such a harsh place. The valley offered some protection, but the storm was unyielding. They worked tirelessly, creating makeshift pens for the cattle and reinforcing what little shelter they could find. Each movement was deliberate, a choreography of survival, and in those small acts, intimacy began to grow. Mara handed him a rag to wipe the sweat and rain from his brow, and their fingers brushed in a moment so simple, yet charged with an unspoken electricity. Elias caught himself staring, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself a fleeting thought of what life could be, not just survived but shared. Night descended with a vengeance, thunder rolling across the valley like the drumbeat of some distant war. They built a fire, small but defiant, and huddled close for warmth. Mara leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, and he felt a strange combination of vulnerability and protection. He could feel her heartbeat in sync with his own, steady and soft, a quiet reassurance that even in the wildest storm, there could be connection. The wind shrieked and tore at the trees, yet in that circle of firelight, they were a world unto themselves. In the quiet hours, as the storm raged outside, Mara spoke softly, almost to herself. Her voice was a thread of warmth against the cold, and Elias listened, captivated by the gentle cadence. She spoke of her past, of loss, of wandering, of the small triumphs that had kept her alive, and he realized that, in sharing these fragments, they were stitching together a new kind of understanding. He didn't respond with words, only with the occasional squeeze of her hand, the careful adjustment of her blanket, gestures that carried weight far greater than any speech. The following days were a relentless test of endurance. The storm left the land soaked and treacherous, the cattle weakened and wary, and Elias found himself battling not just nature, but the creeping shadows of his own mind. Memories surfaced unbidden, his wife's laughter, the look of his child's eyes before they had parted ways, the betrayals of neighbors long gone. Mara never pressed for explanation. She simply walked beside him, her quiet strength a tether that kept him from being lost to despair. Occasionally, she would meet his gaze and offer a small smile, and in that simple act, a spark of hope ignited. Fragile yet persistent point one afternoon, as the sun broke through ragged clouds, Elias discovered a small, half-buried wooden box near the riverbank. Inside, he found remnants of letters and a child's drawing, faded but intact. The sight brought tears he had not expected, and Mara reached for his hand again, her touch steadying him. Together, they pieced through the remnants, the silence between them carrying the weight of understanding. He didn't need to speak. She knew the grief, the longing, the quiet yearning for a life that had slipped through his fingers. And in that mutual recognition, something unspoken bloomed, an intimacy forged in shared pain, in resilience, in the simple act of being present for one another. As they sat by the fire that night, watching sparks rise into the dark sky, Elias finally allowed himself a thought that had long been forbidden. Perhaps the world was not entirely empty. Perhaps love could still grow in the soil of loss. Mara rested her head against him again, a gentle warmth against the chill, and for a moment, he let go of the past. The storm outside was a distant roar, the wolves a shadow on the edge of the valley. Inside, there was light, there was life, and for the first time in a long time, there was the possibility of something more than survival. There was the tender pulse of hope, and with it the slow, certain beat of the heart learning to trust again. The storm had passed, leaving the prairie slick with mud and glistening under a tentative sunrise. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. Yet a tension lingered, invisible but heavy, pressing on Elias's shoulders. The cattle were restless, and somewhere in the distance, the faint howl of wolves reminded him that life on this land had never been forgiving. He moved with care, each step measured, the weight of age and fatigue slowing his pace. But Mara's presence beside him lent a steadying rhythm. She walked close, hands occasionally brushing his, a silent promise that they faced whatever came together as they tended to the scattered herd. Movement on the ridge caught Elias's eye. Figures appeared in the haze. Men on horseback, faces obscured by scarves and wide-brimmed hats. Bounty hunters. He stiffened, his pulse quickening. Mara noticed the change instantly, and without words, she reached for his arm, grounding him. Together, they guided the cattle into a narrow ravine, hidden from view as best they could. Their hearts pounded in sync, each step a delicate dance between survival and fear. The first shots rang out, sharp and sudden. Dust and grit filled the air as men chased them down the trail. Elias's hands, once trembling with age, were now steady, gripping the rifle with precision born of years and necessity. Mara moved beside him, agile and unflinching, helping to herd the animals while keeping low behind rocks and fallen logs. Every glance they shared carried meaning, a silent communication, a reassurance, a pulse of trust and connection stronger than words. Hours stretched into chaos. The bounty hunters pressed closer, relentless, but the land itself became their ally. Narrow passes and hidden gullies slowed their pursuers, while Elias and Mara navigated with intimate knowledge of the terrain. Mud slicked their boots, rainwater filled their sleeves, and the wind whipped their hair into their faces. Yet through it all, they moved together as one, a unit forged not just by necessity, but by something deeper, something tender and unspoken. You bend in the trail. Mara slipped, catching herself on a tree, and Elias's hand shot out instinctively. Their fingers met again, holding tight, grounding each other against the storm of pursuit. For a moment, time seemed to pause. The world narrowed to the heat of their clasped hands, the steady heartbeat that mirrored his own. Then reality surged back. The hunters pressed, the animals panicked, but Elias felt a surge of clarity. He realized what he had known all along. He would fight, not just for survival, but for the fragile ember of connection he had found with Mara. The final confrontation came at the edge of a canyon, where the earth fell away sharply and the wind screamed through the gap. The hunters approached cautiously, aware of the dangerous terrain. Elias raised his rifle, not with anger, but with resolve, and Mara positioned herself at his side. The first man stepped forward, misjudging the footing, and a shout echoed before the canyon swallowed him in dust. The rest hesitated, and in that pause, Elias and Mara moved with swift precision, guiding the remaining cattle to safety and retreating into the narrow canyon path. Every move was precise, every glance meaningful. There was no chaos, only controlled, deliberate action born of desperation and trust. When the last echoes of pursuit faded, the canyon fell silent. Rain dripped from rocks, and the wind carried a faint, hopeful warmth. Elias sank to the ground, exhausted, his rifle resting across his knees. Mara knelt beside him, brushing the mud from his face, and he let out a long breath, the first real release in days. Her hand lingered on his cheek, thumb tracing a line of sweat and grime. And in that touch was both reassurance and a question neither needed to speak. He leaned into it, closing his eyes, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. They stayed there through the night, the firelight flickering against the canyon walls, casting long shadows that danced with the memory of the storm. Elias felt the weight of decades lift slightly from his chest as Mara's presence offered warmth and comfort. In the quiet, he spoke her name softly, almost a prayer, and she responded with a gentle smile, eyes bright with understanding and something more, a spark of shared hope, a subtle, tender romance that had grown in the cracks of hardship and fear. Morning came again, soft and forgiving. Elias knelt in the wet soil near the canyon's edge and planted seeds he had saved, one by one, careful and deliberate. Each seed was a promise, a testament to endurance, to life continuing even after loss, even after struggle. Mara watched, leaning on his shoulder, her hand brushing against his as he worked. In the silence, there was a conversation deeper than words, of gratitude, of love, of resilience. Together, they nurtured the land, each gesture a quiet act of creation, each glance a reaffirmation of what they had discovered in one another. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, scarred and raw, yet alive with possibility. Elias looked at Mara, the wind tugging her hair across her face, and realized that he had found not just survival, but something worth protecting. Her eyes met his steady and warm, and he felt a weight lift from his heart, the weight of years of loss, of loneliness. Together, they had weathered storms both literal and of the soul, and together they would face whatever lay ahead. Yes, they packed their few belongings and guided the cattle toward a distant horizon. Elias whispered, almost to himself, spread wider. Let take root. Mara smiled, her fingers brushing his, and the connection between them deepened, unspoken but undeniable. The prairie, vast and untamed, seemed less lonely now. Life was fragile, storms would come again, and the world was still harsh, but with hope and trust, with love quietly blossoming. Even the loneliest heart could plant a seed that would grow. And so they walked together into the morning light, footprints side by side in the wet earth, carrying the memory of storms survived, the quiet fire of connection, and the promise that even in the most desolate places, love could find a way. Even when the world has turned its back, even when storms have swept everything away, there is always a seed worth planting. Hold on to it, nurture it, and let it grow. Life finds a way, and so does love.